Toastmasters and guests. You're a guest?
I'm a new member. I'm Andrew.
All right, nice to meet you, Andrew.
Nice to meet you too.
I wasn't here on the last one, so probably that's when you joined.
Yep.
So, by now, Heather should have a cornucopia amount of knowledge, being this her speech number 7 from the competent communicator. Her objective is, or the objective of these tasks is to collect information from a number of sources and carefully support points with specific facts, examples, illustrations, rather than just with the speaker's own opinions. The speaker is to incorporate what she has learned in previous projects about purpose, organization, word usage, body language, and vocal variety. That. As well as use appropriate suggestions from evaluations received. The speech time is 5 to 7 minutes, and it's titled Losing Fido. With that, I welcome Heather to the podium.
Good morning, fellow Toastmasters. Glad to see our room is slowly increasing in density as we roll into fall. Thank you very much, Louise, for a wonderful introduction. Only people who are capable of loving strongly can also suffer great sorrow. That's from Leo Tolstoy. So when we think of love and we think of grief, we often associate those emotions with humans. And today I'd like to make you think about those in a different way. We associate grief and love with family members and loved ones. And these days, those things also pertain to animals. More than any other time in history, we have animals as part of our family, whether it's a furry friend, a reptilian, whether it's a bird. We all have different tastes, but we can no doubt agree that animals are part of our family. Now, when we lose a member of a family, even a furry one, we often experience grief. And recently, my family lost one of our family pets, so it seemed fitting that I would spend the time researching this idea of grief. And while it's hard to think of human grief, and we've all experienced that in some form or fashion, I didn't necessarily want to focus on my own grief. I actually wanted to focus on the idea of animal grief, and whether or not animals do in fact experience the depth of emotion that we consider grief. And there is actually a flip side to that coin. A lot of us may right out of the gate say, well, of course they do. But there's another argument that is had by some in the scientific community that that's something, that's a key example of anthropomorphism, which essentially is assigning human emotions to non-human things, being animals, pets, whatever that may be. So having spent nearly 10 years of my career early on working with animals, I personally think that that is true, that they do in fact experience emotions and grief. However, there have been decades and decades of science that have gone into trying to prove this as an actual thing. Can they experience grief or other emotions? So in 2013, Psychology Today, which is not explicit to animals, it goes into human psychology, spent an entire article discussing this concept of grief in animals. And a quote from that article described the following. It's a quote, "Among the different emotions that animals display clearly and unambiguously is grief," end quote. Now that particular sentence struck me. The description, the adjectives that they use, clearly and unambiguously, that's pretty descriptive. And it doesn't leave a whole lot of margin for error. And it implies that there's not really a question on whether or not that is true. Now the most notable examples from research occur in animals that we consider intelligent, things like elephants and primates, dolphins, whales. But it also occurs in other socially bonded species, whether it is wolves or llamas, actually had a really good example, or our personal favorites, dogs and cats. Now they've been observed in the wild, and researchers specifically on elephants have found that after a member of an elephant group, typically a family member, passes, that elephants will actually spend a great deal of energy trying to essentially revive that member of the family. They'll pick them up with their tusks, still try and prop them up into sitting positions. They've been seen bringing water and food to the animal as they lay on the ground. And so there's no doubt that they are processing what is in fact a loss of their family member. So it has been observed. And when scientists are studying this, they're trying to put parameters on that. You know, is that actually grief? And what psychologists and animal behaviorists have looked at is how do you quantify that? How do you wrap that in science? And so how they define it is it's a visible response to death, which includes altered routines and emotional distress. So it's not simply going to check something out from an observation standpoint, it's actually altering your behavior. Now when humans lose a family member or a pet or something, we experience grief. We get to do that from the safety of our home. Oftentimes we spend time with family, we skip work, we have a very safe environment to experience this emotion. When you think about animals, especially in nature, they don't have that luxury. If you're talking about a herd of wolves or a flock of birds, they are on 24/7. They have threats coming at them for their own survival. And so the idea that a group of animals of whatever species would take the time to rally and physically stay present around a lost member of their herd or their family group actually suggests that they are willing to take on the risks and disadvantages of holding vigil near an animal, which has been seen for days and even weeks at a time in some species. They're foregoing food, they're congregating in an area, which you can imagine is a risk to their own predation. So from a behaviorist and biology standpoint, there is a reason why these animals are going through this process, despite the disadvantages and risks that they're actually experiencing. And so most behaviorists have agreed that not only do they display behaviors that suggest grief, but it is important for them to go through that process, so much so that they're actually choosing to do that despite the disadvantages. They've also been seen holding what we would associate with something like funerals or wakes. There are gorillas that have been observed actually passing through not only their own family circles, but surrounding social groups will essentially visit a lost individual. They'll bring food and rocks and they'll leave it and pass through. And so it's really a striking example of something like grief and paying respects in something that is completely non-human. And while we attach that to our own experiences, we can see that there is a significance to their own experience of that. Now, if these are so consistently observed, we as humans should not be so arrogant to assume that we are the only living beings that can feel that depth of emotion. Now, with our own pets, like dogs, they often refuse food and may choose to alter their behaviors. And recently, between psychologists and veterinarians, they actually suggest for dogs, if you have a companion dog, that there's a benefit to letting them be part of that process, to actually see the loss of their companion dog or animal, and that they have the ability to comprehend the permanence of death. And that's something interesting I would have never experienced or even thought of, to allow them to participate in that loss. But they've shown that it actually shortens the duration of that grief. So I personally believe that animals, both domestic and wild, experience grief as evidenced by scientific research. And their bond to humans means that they can also experience the loss and distress when that bond is broken. So as Tolstoy implied, grief is the price of commitment.